Yeah. You've already had them.
Where are we in the Love?
So we're going to be in the last few chapters, the last section of the book.
4?
Yes, part 4. That's where we will be. That's right. So
Okay.
as we talk about here, so this section is called Radical Subversives. What do you think of, and is it positive or negative when you think of somebody being a subversive?
Negative.
Negative? You think it's negative? Why do you think it's negative? Anyone want to?
Because of under.
Underhanded.
Define subversive?
Define it for me.
Let's see here. Then you can tell me. Well, let's.
It's a start.
Well, it depends on who you're being subversive.
Look at us.
Who you're being subversive to. So seeking or intended to subvert, that's helpful, to an establishment, system, or institution. Well, let's look at subvert. Let's see here. Past tense.
Undermine.
There you go. Undermine the power or authority. Establish a system of institutions. So, okay, so that's kind of undermine is a good word there. Let's get back over to Zoom so that we can see Midge and Ed. And so, like, do you have a positive or negative kind of connotation to the word of someone's a subversive? Yeah.
Being a child of the 60s,
Yeah.
and going to college and stuff, I don't look at it as necessarily a bad term.
Yeah.
That's my viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on your viewpoint
Yeah.
and what the institutions you want to subvert are doing.
Yeah. So sometimes there's some that need it, and sometimes some that don't. Is what you're kind of saying, right? Okay. Anyone else want to have an opinion?
You think of them as somebody who rocks the boat.
Someone rocks the boat.
You're happy with the way things are going. You don't like the person.
Yeah.
They're going to undo what's comfortable.
Martin Luther comes to mind.
Yeah. Our church kind of carries his name just a little bit, and so we think of him, and he was definitely for the powers in Rome. That he was a bit of a subversive. That's.
He was making corrections.
Making corrections, yeah.
That's our opinion. Talk to the Catholics.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. And we definitely would agree with that, but yeah, like kind of like Ed says.
The Catholics started out as a good institution.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. It was a universal church. And it fell away.
Well, others came in.
Well, greed came in with the church and state. They wanted to rule and they wanted to control the people. And sometimes that goes on today in the church. They want to control the people. Wouldn't go on here, would it, Chris?
So we're going to be talking about subversive stuff kind of all day today, because I really, and if you listen to any amount of my preaching or teaching, I really treat Jesus like a subversive. And I kind of think the kingdom of God often has very subversive tendencies, because I think, and remind me what your guys' names are again. I'm sorry.
Eric and Carol.
I'm awful with names. So
That's good.
but it's, I think we saw that one of the downfalls of the Catholic Church has been when it gained this superpower status, that's over there, and they started blending that way of God and superpower status there together, and you see that Jesus is kind of constantly pushing against that. And I think it's kind of what Philip Yancey's trying to get at. I think that's kind of one of the things that he's doing.
One of the traps is all these ones that were in the Catholic Church. They liked their eminence, their high standing. They just were gloating in it, right?
Yeah.
They thought they were the only ones that had it right.
Mm-hmm.
They liked to lord it over the people.
And I don't think we'll talk about it today in the verses that I have prepared for us, but even Jesus said that about the Pharisees, that these religious leaders like to lord it over people. They like to lord it over them and let them know, like, ooh,
Who's in control?
This is really who's in charge.
They had was the physical word, and they did. They had the literal word. He was the real word, the spiritual word. And they couldn't handle that because it was superior to what they already knew literally.
Yeah, and so
They could not accept
He
it.
was, the word became flesh, right? He was,
But one's spiritual, the other's.
the Bible says some pretty profound things that we have a hard time to grab. That's for sure.
yeah. So let's watch the video and see what it's telling us, and we can talk about it afterwards. So
I love the term holy subversion. I just think it's an amazing term that describes a lot of what this has all been all about. Like we thought that we were going to be missionaries in Africa. We thought we were going to do a big ministry. And here we found out that our biggest gift, it seems, has been just living through our trial.
I've titled this session, Holy Subversives. I know I need to explain that word, subversive. What do I mean by it? I want to tell you about my favorite image of the church. It comes from a true event that took place in 2004 in the country of Ukraine. As you know, Ukraine has been in turmoil ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it's been in a tug of war with Russia over territory. That all started with what's known as the Orange Revolution. You may not know what took place behind the scenes. For 15 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was still closely allied with Russia and moving ever so slowly toward democracy. Sure, they had elections, but everybody knew in advance who would win because the ruling party counted the votes. And if you think our elections are dirty, when a man named Viktor Yushchenko dared to challenge the party in power, he nearly died from a mysterious case of dioxin poison. Somebody tried to kill him. Most people expected he would pull out of the race, but he didn't. His body weakened, his face permanently disfigured by the poison. Yushchenko stayed in the race until the bitter end. On election day, the exit poll showed him with a 10% victory, but the party in power counted the votes. That evening, a state-run television station reported, "Ladies and gentlemen, we announce that the challenger, Viktor Yushchenko, has been decisively defeated." However, the government had not taken into account one feature of Ukrainian television. In the lower right-hand corner of the screen, picture in picture, a translator does sign language for the hearing impaired. This brave woman gave a very different message in sign language. She said, in effect, "They say Yushchenko lost. Don't believe them. They're lying through their teeth." And so it was that deaf people, inspired by their translator, actually started the Orange Revolution. They got on their cell phones and text messaged their friends saying they should gather in the town square to protest the stolen election. And over the next few weeks, as many as 1 million people wearing orange flooded the capital city to demand another vote. The government finally gave in and held new elections, and this time Yushchenko emerged as the undisputed winner. When I first heard that story, it occurred to me that the image of a little screen in the corner of the big screen was an ideal picture of the church. You see, we in the church do not control the big screen. In fact, when we do, we usually mess it up. Who's on the big screen? Turn on your television, go to any magazine rack, and you will see a consistent message. What matters is how beautiful you are, how much money or power you have. Magazine covers feature shapely supermodels and handsome hunks, even though very few people look like that. Those of you who are parents know what a devastating impact that relentless big screen message can have on an unattractive teenager. And though the world includes many poor people, They rarely make the magazine covers or the news shows either. Instead, we tend to focus on the super rich and the famous and the lifestyles of the rich and famous. A sports writer calculated that any superstar NBA basketball player, and these are guys who are very good at putting a round ball through a round hoop, those guys with that talent earn more money than the entire United States Senate put together. Now, some of you may think a basketball player deserves more money than the Senate, but think about it. What kind of society values one person's athletic skill more than the contributions of all the people who pass its laws? Our society is hardly unique. Throughout history, nations have always glorified winners, not losers. And then, like the sign language translator in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, along comes a person named Jesus who says, in effect, don't believe the big screen. They're lying. It's the poor who are blessed, not the rich. Those who mourn are blessed, as well as those who hunger and thirst and the persecuted. People who go through life thinking they're on top will end up on the bottom. And those who go through life feeling like they're at the very bottom will end up on top. After all, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and lose his soul? Can you see why I use the word subversion? Jesus calls us to act in a way radically unlike the world around us, a new way to be human, to see the same worth in a homeless person as in a billionaire, to devote attention to the weak and the sick, not just the glamorous and the beautiful, to live with the goal of pleasing God, not just to feed our own ego and rise in prestige. Cliff and Wilma Dirksen are two people that I consider subversive in the best sense of the word. They're Mennonites. They live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, up in Canada. Now, Mennonites aren't normally flashy, and they don't seek the spotlight. The Dirksens didn't either, but suddenly they were thrust into the news when their daughter was kidnapped.
I don't think there was a bigger manhunt in Winnipeg like that. We were just, and it wasn't big enough for us. We just wanted everybody just to stop their lives and look for Candace. And then 7 weeks later, her body was found in a shack not that far from our place. Living in that suspense of 7 weeks was pure hell. And so then to find her body, as strange as it might seem, was a kind of relief. So as we were going through this up and down, there was a knock on the door at 10 o'clock that night. And there was a man at the door that looked vaguely familiar, but we didn't really know who he was. And he said that he was a man whose daughter was murdered. And he was welcoming us into a new society, parents of murdered children. And so we invited him in, and he spent 2 hours at our dining room table and just unfolded his life for us. And we could really enter into his pain. And he more or less said our lives were over. The murder had cost him his ability to think, his ability to work, his ability to love, his ability to cope, and just his whole freedom of life. And we just saw a very broken man who seemed to almost be breaking as we were speaking to him. And we were just floored at what we were seeing and seeing the potential that was lying ahead of us.
And he ended by saying that the worst of it all was that it had destroyed even the good memories that he had had of his daughter who had been killed. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I decided this was God speaking to me now. And he was telling me, you know what way to go. And it's not this way.
After the man left, Cliff and I went to bed, and we had to deal with a lot of things that evening. We had to deal with identifying Candace's body and the death and the influx of friends and the grief. But the main thing that stuck out for us was this horrible picture of what was going to happen to us. Was this going to cost us our marriage, our children, our lives? And it was like as if we were realizing that murder had taken our daughter. The aftermath of murder was going to take us. And we were actually facing some critical decision making. And so we talked about it, and even that night, and just said we were going to do something different. The search committee called a press conference for us because we wanted to thank the city of Winnipeg for being there with us, and we wanted to thank them for all the work that they'd done. And after the conference was over, after the lights went down, one of the reporters just asked, "And what are you going to do about the murderer? What are you going to do with the offender?" And we just said, well, we don't know who did it, for one thing. But we have resolved that we're going to forgive. I think choosing forgiveness has always been counterintuitive for me. I've always felt that it is hard and is kind of meant to be hard. It's not something that's going to come naturally. It's always dying to self. It's always saying, okay, that's how I feel. And I have every right to feel that because I have experienced murder, and I know that the rage is an indication that I love. That's who I am. Now, how can I set that aside and look beyond what I am to the other person and look at them to see what do they need? Because God loves them.
You can't make a person forgive. It has to be a decision of the will. And unless it is a decision of the will and they work at it, it will not happen. And in my case, I had to make a definitive decision that this forgiveness thing was going to be real. And I had to work at it. I had to put the work gloves on and go for it and find it.
For 22 years, we didn't really know who had taken Candace, and there were no real strong suspects. There wasn't even a good theory about it. None of it made sense. So it's really difficult to forgive somebody that you know. It's almost even more difficult to forgive somebody that you don't know. After Mark Edward Grant was arrested, we were very, of course, interested in the story of what had happened. And it took us right back to all the pain and the hurt. Just to have Candace's jacket and her jeans being brought into the courtroom, to hear the medical examiner's testimony, it was excruciating painful. And yet we wanted to be there for Candace. It's like a horror show. And so we went right back having to think, okay, now how do we get through this? And how do we get through this rage? Again, we chose to forgive.
There are people that will stop us any day of the week, and even today. Before you came, we were at the superstore to pick up some of these treats we're eating here today, and 2 people recognized us and said, and encouraged us, keep up the good work, keep up what you're doing, I know what you're doing, go for it, do it. And those kind of words, without using the word forgiveness, and yet you knew exactly what they were talking about, what they were meaning.
We were really surprised at the attention that was given to our choosing to forgive. We were just amazed because I'm a journalist. I know that the story was about murder, and the next day it should have been about the funeral of Candace and how the end of the search and all of that. But what really happened was the next day in the newspapers, it was all about our choice to forgive. And I just had never thought that that was of any importance to anybody. It was just our response. And we hadn't even accomplished that yet. It kind of, over the years, has kept us almost accountable to that because we had declared it so publicly. I think often the church has been condemning and has wanted to move people through forgiveness too quickly. And knowing that, I was able to sit with people and stay with them in it and make them make their own choice through the death and the murder of our daughter. Just surviving that has in some ways communicated that there is another way, that God is in control and wants to teach us another way to fight evil.
The Dirksons never asked to be put in a spotlight, but first because of the crime and then later the trial, they became the focus of national attention. And that's still having ripple effects 2 decades later. The renowned writer Malcolm Gladwell, who has written several #1 best-selling books, such as Blink and The Tipping Point, met the Dirksons while he was researching another book, The Story of David and Goliath. Something stirred inside him, and ultimately it changed him. Gladwell saw up close what it's like to follow a different path, not the big screen message of violence and revenge, but instead to follow the little screen message of forgiveness, compassion, and love. This is how Gladwell describes what took place. Something happened to me when I sat in Wilma Dirkson's garden. It's one thing to read in a history book about people empowered by their faith, but it is quite another to meet an otherwise very ordinary person in the backyard of a very ordinary house who has managed to do something utterly extraordinary. Their daughter was murdered, and the first thing the Dirksons did was to stand up at the press conference and talk about the path to forgiveness. He adds, "Maybe we have difficulty seeing the weapons of the Spirit because we don't know where to look, or because we're distracted by the louder claims of material advantage. But I've seen them now, and I will never be the same." Gladwell's encounter with the Dirksons pulled him back toward the faith of his childhood, for he had also grown up in a Mennonite community and then moved far away. I would urge you to keep that image of the big screen, little screen before you. Don't let the broader culture determine your values or your standard of success. Follow the way of the little screen, the way of Jesus. Remember Malcolm Gladwell, sophisticated staff writer for The New Yorker at the very top of his field. But when he encountered the faith of an ordinary Mennonite family, it changed him forever. I love one particular story from the Old Testament. It occurred on one of the happiest days in the history of Israel. David was king at last, and the treasured Ark of the Covenant was being brought back to Jerusalem, the capital city. Think of the biggest 4th of July parade you've ever seen. It was something like that, with marching bands, soldiers, processions, and a huge barbecue. King David got so caught up in the celebration that he started dancing, leaping around so enthusiastically that some of his clothes fell off. Imagine the king of a country prancing around in his underwear. His wife was scandalized. She said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls." David shot right back, "It wasn't for you I was dancing, or for those slave girls. I was dancing for God." David had a one-person audience, God. If God was pleased, nothing else mattered. Frankly, I believe that was the key to David's success. He was far from perfect, you know. He committed murder and adultery. But in the end, God called him a man after my own heart. Why? Because despite all of his faults, David lived for God, not the people around him. He had an audience of one. We've covered a lot of ground in our times together, and I hope you found it to be worthwhile. We've just scratched the surface, of course. Christians will continue to face confusing questions. How much should we get involved in politics? How should we respond when we face hostility for what we believe? What's the best way to talk about our faith? I leave you with this principle. If we follow the same pattern that David did, if we live to please God rather than the world around us, if we keep our eyes on the little screen That's all that matters. And if we do it with grace, showing the world a different way to live, the world sits up and takes notice. Ordinary people can have an extraordinary impact, just as the Dirksons did on Malcolm Gladwell. Grace has that power. For whatever reason, God has chosen ordinary people like us, you, me, the person sitting next to you, to communicate God's message of love for the world, to dispense grace. May you too be a grace dispenser to a thirsty world.
So what stood out to you? And I encourage us not to go into the election stuff because that is political dribble, and I doubt they would use that if they were making the video now rather than they did 15 years. But so what kind of stood out to you? What do you think was interesting on that?
I think it was interesting what she said about forgiveness, that you work at it. It's not like, okay, I forgive you. No, it's like daily or multiple times a day, just re-forgive me, reaffirming that that's the you're what you want to do.
Yeah, that can be very hard.
Yeah.
When you're working on that. Yeah, Pam.
Well, it was also interesting that she said, I had the right to be angry, and I had this rage because it was coming from my love, my child, and then I had to kind of just set my feelings aside before she could move on or start her forgiveness. So I don't know if that really meant that she just, had to let her feelings go first before she start the forgiveness. I didn't know exactly where she was going with that, but I found that interesting.
And that's hard to do. Very hard to do sometimes.
And in and of yourself, it's impossible.
Yeah, but she had to do that first, realize,
By way of the Holy Spirit, no other way. It's not going to be by your works. I don't care how hard you work. It's going to be by way of grace and the Holy Spirit. That's what love from afar is. Loving from afar is seeing it done, and the vengeance is God's. All of it. He owns it.
So do you think she was motivated to be forgiving after talking to the gentleman that did not forgive, when she saw how his life proceeded? I don't know.
Maybe.
That's what I.
The destruction.
That holding
Yes.
on to that hurt.
Yes.
That
Can destroy you.
Absolutely.
giving it up, getting away. Yeah. What did you say?
Giving the opposite power.
Yeah.
To destroy you.
Well, and that's again, for people who've been here around, kind of one of the core aspects of my theology is this idea of power. And oftentimes forgiveness is that we love to hold those grudges because it gives us power over somebody else. It's like you're in full kind of like what you said a little bit ago, like full ability to be angry, and she could be angry about it for the rest of her life. And that forgiveness is like giving that power away. And that's hard. That's a very real.
When you have a trauma like that, there's a period of time where you have this anger that you want to do something with,
Unless haven't lost a child, you don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. He mentioned Malcolm Gladwell. Have anyone read or familiar with Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah. I really like Malcolm Gladwell books, and he's got a podcast that's really good too. And what's interesting, so he mentioned, all these videos and all that stuff were from 15 years ago, I think 2013, something like that, maybe 10 years ago. is when they did all these videos. So it's a while, and that's very soon after Malcolm Gladwell wrote his book, David and Goliath. And it's very, very good. Probably his most famous book is a book called Tipping Point. You ever heard of it? Tipping Point, anyone? You're like, that's part of it. Yeah, like it's very famous book, very famous book. And he kind of writes about greater society and what's effective. And that's kind of what all of his thing, he takes a very storied look at that. But I've been following Malcolm Gladwell for a while and his podcast. And after David and Goliath, he always focuses on small things and how they change greater society now, which is very interesting. I think because this video is right at the beginning of Malcolm Gladwell kind of realizing this about small stuff. And now that's pretty much what he writes about, is like how these small everyday things affect the bigger picture. And so that's kind of what his career has been about. He writes for the Atlantic and all that stuff. So but it's kind of interesting. So I don't know. You said you're familiar with him. Did you want to say anything about Malcolm?
No, but that's kind of what the whole David and Goliath book kind of shifts your view like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he did bring up an idea, and I think this idea is really good. And Tracy, you just got me there, is that big screen versus small screen. And that's, and I think that idea is very visual and very good idea of that big screen versus small screen, because there's so many times we get influenced by that big screen, and we think that big screen is the one that deserves all of our attention, but it's actually the small screen stuff over here. And I think Jesus is often drawing us into that small screen. Did anyone want to say anything more about any of that before we go on?
Maybe that's one reason we need newspapers still.
Newspapers? Is that the small screen? So sometimes. Maybe just more social media, right? This is a small screen, right? But I think what we're talking about with that small screen is that stuff that's in the corner of society is showing us a different way. So let's go into the Bible. We're first going to do the beginning of Luke chapter 4. And we'll read that. It's the temptation narrative of Jesus. Let's see. I got to remember what to do. It's been a couple weeks. I forgot how. All right, here we go. All right, so we'll listen to this. This is Luke chapter 4, beginning with the first verse, and we'll kind of end out the temptation there. So here we go.
Then Jesus, being filled with the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, being tempted for 40 days by the devil. And in those days he ate nothing, and afterward, when they had ended, he was hungry. And the devil said to him,
"If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread."
It is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God."
Then the devil, taking him up on a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time.
"All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you will worship before me, all will be yours."
Get behind me, Satan. For it is written, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve."
Then he brought him to Jerusalem, set him on the pinnacle of the temple.
"If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you to keep you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone."
It has been said, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God."
Now when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time.
Okay, that's good enough there. That's good enough there. Okay, so with this idea of big screen versus little screen, plus anything else that you would like to say about the temptation of Jesus, within reason, like that's what you see was going on inside of our reading here?
I don't think the devil really cares what's written.
The devil doesn't care about what's written. Yeah, just kind of uses it to his own ends.
Just Jesus is just pointing it out to him apparently and saying, "See." But the devil probably,
like you word that in a very interesting way, and I think that's actually kind of an astute way you're wording that. The devil doesn't care about what's written. Some of you've kind of read between the lines and all of that stuff and seen what's going on in Synod right now. We're really dealing with this attack from like neo-Nazi groups, white nationalist groups, like all these things inside the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod right now. And these guys don't really care about the stuff that's written either. And they'll just quote bomb something. And I think it's very interesting kind of how you worded that is that, and we have to be careful about doing that too, about just quote bombing things. Because like you quote bomb something, I wonder if we actually care about what the quote is about, rather than just, I want to win this argument.
Context.
Yeah, like talking about the context of it. And so maybe big screen there is actually just winning the argument rather than actually bringing love in.
Are you familiar with the term? I bet some other people are proof texts.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Proof text.
Proof text.
Yeah. So you pick and choose which you want to prove, and you pick and choose your text.
Yeah. Yeah. Ed, you wanted to say something.
The devil also does not care about the truth.
Yeah.
Because he says, this is all my kingdom. It is not.
Yeah.
And second, an interesting point, the Lutheran ELCA, Lutheran Study Bible, leaves out the get thee behind me, Satan line.
Really?
So reflective.
Well, and so in the NIV is leaving that out? Like where?
First one, after the first temptation, they say, "Get behind me, Satan."
Okay.
And then it is written, "Man should not."
So what's probably happening? I have not looked at this at all. What is probably happening there is that you have textual variants. So understanding the written Bible with Chris. All right, this is what this becomes. So the King James, which that is up there, it's the New King James. That's what this is too. Is you have all these sources that the Bible was pulling from all the way there. The NIV and most other modern Bibles are actually going back to previous ones, and that could have been something that's added. And if you look, there's probably a note in the Bible that has it there, and it probably says later sources included this, but we just kind of think it's probably not in there now. And so that's probably what's going on. A lot of people get a lot of consternation about that. Like King James only people be like, they got rid of this many words of the God's holy Bible. Well, it's like, well, like, no, like it's just how kind of scholarship works. And a lot of times it doesn't really change the meaning all that much. And so yeah. But there's probably a note that says, hey, this was in later manuscripts. So does that make sense? It's nothing to be worried about. Like that's all right.
Not in this one.
It's not in there? Okay.
Reference at all.
Okay. So okay, so was there anything else? So when we talk about the big and the little, yeah.
It's free part.
Yeah.
Things that we can do or we do that we don't even realize impact.
Yeah.
Anything. But God can take that and go with it.
Yeah.
And we have no idea what He is doing if our heart is in the right place. He just enhances whatever you do.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. And what this really reminds me of, this was our lead text for the last Vanishing Grace sermon. And that what we see is that Jesus was like tempted in every way, like we are here. And you see like that first temptation is all about the bread, you know, and like that recalls in my mind, like back to like Esau, like Jacob and Esau, and how Esau was willing to trade his own life and everything he had for that one bowl of soup. You know, like he's willing to trade everything. And you think about that food, when you're hungry, that food becomes that big picture. You know, like that's that big thing. And yet Jesus is like, no, we still need to be trusting. You know, in that little picture. Yeah, go ahead.
Physical food or spiritual food.
Yeah.
Physically seeing is going to be wide. It's going to be big.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritually seeing is going to be a smaller screen.
Yeah.
It will be the truth. You have a wide path for destruction and a narrow one that leads.
Yeah.
So it's a way of seeing spiritually or physically.
Mm-hmm.
Way of eating spiritually or physically. Brandon was talking about the physical.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking, everything has to be in this book converted to spiritually seeing. Otherwise, it's a physical word.
Well, it is physical though, because Jesus is the Word made flesh,
right?
And stuff like that.
Yes, he came in, was man. He was 100% God, 100% man.
And he still is.
He also gave you a clue when he said, "My words are spirit and they are life."
Yeah.
So you got to scratch your head on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that I am aware of, I guess is the best, is kind of always pushing against the Gnostic tendencies in our churches. So Gnosticism is one of the OG heresies. Paul talked a lot about it, and basically what Gnosticism says is that at some point I'll be able to know enough, either spiritually or whatever, and I'll be able to shed this body of decay and go into the great celestial realms, and I won't have anything that's hindering anymore. We kind of have this sense of like, oh, it's my body that's hindering me, type of thing. That's Gnosticism. What we see is that it goes back to what I said about the cross earlier, is that the cross is intensely physical, intensely dirty, because God presents himself as a gardener. And when God wants to come and save mankind, wants to be with us, he comes in the Old Testament in the tabernacle, but we see that the tabernacle becomes flesh, like that's in Jesus, and we're saved by that physicality type of idea there. And so this, what's fun about this temptation narrative is that it really pushes that line, because you have that spiritual nature to it as well. That we know that God can keep us, even in the midst of hunger and all of those things, but that he cares about those physical attributes too. So I don't know if I'm making any sense anymore. I feel like my cold medicine is catching up with me now. But that's
good. Make bread out of nothing when he fed the 5,000.
Yeah.
4,000. It wasn't that he couldn't do it. It was that he didn't do it then. And I really think, because I'm reading Philippians, his other book.
Okay.
But he talks about this too, that the devil was giving Jesus shortcuts to what the world thought of powerful leader.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing. Power.
Yeah. And
what the Jewish leaders expected out of their Messiah.
they wanted that. Now, Eric? Yeah, you had your hand up.
I was going to say a couple things, but it says here, Jesus was in every way tempted.
Yeah.
We concede to the fact that Jesus was 100% God, 100% man.
Yeah.
When he went into the wilderness to be tempted, who was the devil? Was he battling his physical nature? his physical presentation, you know, and he counteracted all that with the word of God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I argue with myself, do we understand who the devil really is? Now, this is a highly controversial subject. The devil, I believe, resides right between our ears.
Okay, yeah.
It's the physical opposition that you come against all the time. You know,
So what you're saying is almost like you have the bad Jiminy Cricket going on inside you.
The Afro-American comedian, you know, said, you know, the devil made me do it. I forget his name right now off the top of my head. And we do that all the time. The pulpit has you blaming it on the devil, blaming it on the devil. You read the book of James. James don't blame it on the devil.
Yeah.
He blames it on the temptation that rises up, and the temptation gives manifestation, you know. I mean, James don't talk about a devil. He says that right there, your opposition is right within yourself.
Yeah. So one of the things when Ed was talking about power there, one of the things that is my thesis and all of this is we did Gospel of Mark last year during this time in the church, and I really see Mark is revealing what true power really looks like, and it's really having us confront these three, as Philip Yancey says, these three big screens that are going on, and that Mark is revealing the power of self, the power of here, political power, and religious power, that we want all three of them, and that he's constantly revealing that there isn't anything there the whole time. They're just vapid. And if you look at the temptations here, it's still those three things. Like you have, you know, the ability to make bread for yourself, you know, supply for yourself your own needs, and then you go straight into political power. You know, that big screen. He's like, look at all these powers of the world, right? And then you have the religious power where he takes them on top of the temple, right? And I think we often chase those things. Like, man, I get so frustrated when people will come up to me. It's like they're trying, like they're being successful in killing the church, or they're like, we got to take our culture back, or like all this. And I'm just like, that's just power seek. That's that big screen. You know, that's that big screen. Like how they can't take your ability to show your next door neighbor who has problems walking around love. They can't take that away. They may be able to take bread away from you, but that's big screen. And they may be able to take big screen stuff away, but they can't take those little screens. And it's amazing how that temptation kind of shows us all three of those. I don't know. Did anyone want to say anything?
Well, they also can't legislate telling people you have to love your neighbor.
No, there's no way.
There's
no way.
Yeah.
It would become a dystopian nightmare.
I've stood in front of a lot of pulpits where that's the key message.
It is.
Yeah, love God.
Oh, yeah.
You gotta love your neighbor. You know, you gotta. It sounds like law to me. You know, love yourself. You cannot do that.
Yeah.
You come against the hardship in your life. You know, some extreme than others, and at that point, ain't no way.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, you have to look at yourself as Jesus makes all these statements. When he's repeating these things, the one who could do all this was standing right in front of him.
Right.
You know, he was the one that could love his neighbor unto death. You know, only he could do that. You know, don't ask me to do that.
Yeah. So let's read the next one, because this continues, like Jesus continues just pushing into this small green screen identity. So let's look at this next one, and it's Matthew chapter 5. It's the Beatitudes.
Listen, but I can't.
We should all be pretty familiar with this. So we'll go through here. I don't know how much we're going to read, but we'll read a good bit of it. Not a lot though.
And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain. And when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
The salt and light too.
You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Okay. So what kind of stood out to there? Like where do you see that big screen versus little screen idea happening here?
All the things he said are blessed are not what people usually think are good things.
Yeah. Like I will always remember, I have so many stories from my previous church, but like this one guy who also didn't like me very much, but I did like a sermon on the Beatitudes once, and he tried to tell me ad nauseum that meekness was actually like this way of holding strength, which I would agree that, like, you know, you have that, but no, he was like, it was like classic version of strength. And I was like, I don't think that's what meek means, man. Like that's, and he was always wanting like the church to be strong and tell people how to live and, you know, all that stuff. And, you know, kind of like what you're saying, like, you got to do all these things. And like, when you hear how Jesus presents that, he's like, it's not like he's telling you how to live. It's giving you this vision of a different way, of that small screen of like.
It's the quiet things that you do.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the bombastic, where you see your neighbor sitting outside in a wheelchair and you just go over and have a chat.
Mm-hmm. And that's,
which is what I do all the time.
but that's, you know, and we can often think like, oh, that won't do anything, but that ends up being everything. You know, I look back at my own life and I see the people that have invested in me and have gotten me to this point in my life. And no, none of you know who they are. I can say most of their names, you know, but they just took a little bit extra time with a kid that probably should have been on some type of ADD medicine. You know, like that's all it was. That's all it was. And so, but you see this kind of other vision. Did anyone else want to say anything? I have another little story that I was going to say.
Well, and I think too, like with meekness and Holy Spirit, we started with Philip Yancey talked about that too, that the attitude that you'll never look in someone's eyes that God doesn't love.
Mhm.
I'm no better
Mhm.
than that homeless guy on the
Yeah.
street who's never been to church. Jesus loves him just as much as he loves me. No matter how much studying I do, no matter how many Bible verses I can quote, that love doesn't change. And I need to love him
Yeah.
like Jesus does, or anybody, my neighbor who's driving me nuts or whatever.
Yeah.
It's gonna be meek and love.
Mhm. Was there anything else? The story that I was going to tell is, I remember this is my past church too, but this will be a good story. It's this guy, his name was Doug, and Doug called me. It's like, my friend just died. And Doug was probably 50 something at the time. And I was like, oh, like, do we need to go get a beer somewhere? And he said, like, the most humanizing thing I've ever heard. He's like, I've already started. like that. And I was like, okay, I hear that. I'll come to your house, And so I came to his house, and these two guys were just inseparable, and his wife just found him, and his friend was probably high 50s, way too early than should be, type of thing. And I just found him in bed when she woke up, type of thing. And he just couldn't see it. And I remember I said this, and this is one of the more inspired things I've ever said. I don't know where it came from, but sometimes we say the right things, right? And I remember I was like, there's so many times when it appears like the darkness is so big and overcoming that it feels like the light can never shine through it, that the darkness is too thick and we can't see. And I said, but here's the truth. And in his backyard, he had like 5 acres or something like that. It was just all grasslands, kind of to some trees, kind of down at the edge of his property. And I said, the truth is that I could go down there and I could take a lighter, just a Bic lighter, and I could light it. And even though I'm way down there, you'd be able to see it. No problem. And I said, sometimes that darkness feels so big and overpowering, but even the smallest of light can shine through any amount of darkness. And it was wild just seeing him just be able to calm down off of that, just calm down just for a second, because we look around and the world can be a scary place. You can feel like darkness is all around us, but even the smallest light can shine through those darknesses. And we see that that's how the kingdom of God works. Mustard seeds, small things, light out in the open, right? Being salty again. And I think that's what Philip Yancey is encouraging us to do, is to be those small lights, to chase after the places and show light of grace to all those around us. And I think that's the encouragement in the book. And that's definitely my encouragement for you here. And the beautiful thing is that even Fred here can do small light stuff. Even Fred, and that's
Not
and so that's kind of how we can end this book here.
Oh, you gave me an opening. You mentioned my name.
Oh, shouldn't have done that. Carol.
You guys talked about forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think about forgiveness, and I've forgiven a lot of people. But when it really hits home to you, as you wonder, you can't do that. A few years ago, I had my car stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about forgiving the guy that did it. I told the police officer who lives across the street, said, all that stuff I've been saying about police brutality, forget it. It was personal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I forgive the guy now because he's in jail for the rest of his life for murdering his girlfriend.
Oh my goodness.
So I don't worry about him. You know, I don't have to forgive
It's a
him.
weird story that you went down here all of a sudden. It's a weird path that you've gone down.
Gee, I'm so glad. I'm sorry I don't have that for my book.
Yeah. But that's I think the book here is really just encouraging us to go down into the small screens and to be light and mustard seeds and realize that that's how God is working. That's how God is working. And that's just encouragement. And the beautiful part is that's for each of us to figure out what that looks like in our own lives. And that's what makes it fun and exciting. And you're going to get it wrong, but that's why Jesus still forgives us. Yeah. But thank you so much for being a part of our lesson here. So for everyone watching online, thank you so much.